Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is to deliver that comprehensive knowledge, the kind that gives you the real context, the nuance, and maybe those surprising facts that just instantly make you feel well-informed.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're taking on something pretty ambitious, a deep dive into the foundations of land and legacy in Jamaica. We're looking at the whole sweep of its history.
Right.
And we're guided by some excellent source material, especially an article from Dean Jones of Jamaica Homes. The goal is to understand how all these events, conquests, rebellions, cultural shifts, how they've fundamentally shaped the very idea, the very value of property on the island today.
That's absolutely key, yeah, because when you analyze Jamaica's current real estate market, you're not starting from scratch, are you?
Not at all.
You're looking at an economy where the land itself carries this profound historical weight. The foundation of today's market, whether it's luxury coastal resorts or government housing projects, it's all built on centuries defined by struggle, by land reform, and, well, aspiration. The sources really show us that the value of the land is just inextricably linked to the stories of figures like Marcus Garvey, like Bob Marley. It's an incredibly rich, complex interplay.
So we're not just listing dates. We're mapping the historical foundation that underpins land titles' development potential today. And before we really dive into the timeline of conquest and commerce, we have to set the scene, right? Establish that vibrant cultural core that makes Jamaica so globally unique.
Definitely.
The materials point straight away to two really essential, globally recognized pillars.
Precisely. First off, there's Rastafarianism. Now, many people might mainly associate it with reggae music, but it's actually a profound spiritual philosophy. It started back in the 1930s.
Okay.
It's rooted deep in African diasporic culture, and it centers on the spiritual belief in Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. You really can't overstate its influence on Jamaican identity, on resilience, and crucially, on the concept of returning to the land.
And the second one, jerk.
Ah, jerk.
Yeah.
It's so much more than just a recipe, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a native style of cooking, uses these unique, vibrant seasonings, usually on chicken or pork.
So you've got this pairing, a deep, globally resonant spiritual philosophy alongside a totally unique, defining cuisine. It just establishes this island identity that wasn't simply imposed from outside.
No, it was forged. Aggressively, brilliantly forged by its people through resilience, through self-determination.
That's the spirit of the island, even before we get into the timeline.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this history, starting right at the very beginning.
All right, so if we follow the historical timeline in the sources, we're going back millennia. Long before any European ships were on the horizon, Jamaica was home to settlers arriving, around 4000 to 1000 BC?
That's right. These really early inhabitants were eventually succeeded by the Taino people, who were generally thought to be of Arawak descent.
Now, this period, it often gets rushed over, doesn't it? But it's important.
It's critical because it established the very first model of interaction with the land there. The Taino, who arrived a bit later, say around 800 AD, they established these vibrant, thriving communities. Their whole lifestyle was defined by sustainable practices.
Sustainable how?
Well, they were skilled in agriculture, used shifting cultivation methods, which actually allowed the land to regenerate. They practiced pottery, they fished, and fundamentally, they revered the land as a communal resource, not private property.
Right, so their relationship with the environment was more about equilibrium, wasn't it? Sustainability. They left behind traces like petroglyphs and artifacts, not huge, permanent extractive structures.
Exactly. They were a successful civilization using that fertile Jamaican soil really effectively.
And that harmonious era, which lasted centuries, it came to a really abrupt, violent end in 1494.
That's the year Christopher Columbus arrives during his second voyage.
Yeah.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just exploration. It was the definitive start of European colonization. It meant the forced displacement of the indigenous population. And it kicked off this catastrophic shift in how land was used.
Spanish settlers arrived pretty soon after, didn't they? Around 1498. Establishing the first Spanish town, Sevilla la Nueva.
Yes, near modern-day St. Anne's Bay. And the agenda, right from the get-go, was pure, systematic exploitation. They wanted Jamaica's natural resources, gold, timber, agricultural land, and of course, this required forced labor.
Which just devastated the Taino population.
Utterly devastated them. Through enslavement, through violence, and crucially through the introduction of European diseases. They had no immunity. It was a demographic collapse, plain and simple.
And then the Spanish crown formalized its control.
By 1508, yes. They granted Jamaica to the Columbus family as a hereditary fiefdom. That solidified Spanish dominance, and it led directly to the expansion of plantations for those highly profitable crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton.
And 1509 is a key date, too, marking the arrival of the first African slaves.
The first documented arrival, yes, brought specifically to toil on these burgeoning sugar plantations. This introduced a new, permanent layer of forced labor designed purely to maximize extraction from the land.
Okay, so here's where we need to make that connection to the origins of colonial real estate law. You mentioned the Spanish introduced the encomienda system.
That's right, in the 1520s, 1530s. And we really need to pause and analyze what this system truly meant, because it is, in effect, the foundational legal template for colonial property ownership in the Americas.
So how is the encomienda system different? You mentioned it wasn't like the Taino system, obviously, but how did it differ from, say, European feudalism?
Well, it was far more extractive. It essentially granted Spanish colonizers control not just over huge tracts of land, but explicitly over the Taino communities living on that land and over their labor.
Right.
So unlike the Taino view, where land was this living communal resource, and maybe unlike some feudal systems that offered certain rights or protections to tenants, encomienda defined both the land and the people on it as a single transferable commodity.
So it wasn't just owning the dirt, it was owning the means of forced wealth extraction, built right into the property title itself.
Exactly. The land became a pure tool for profit, legally justified by the Spanish crown and enforced through sheer violence. This system underpinned that early colonial real estate structure. It defined property not as a resource to be managed, but as a mechanism for perpetual forced wealth transfer back to Europe.
And that precedent, viewing the colonies primarily as resource extraction zones.
It haunts land reform efforts even today. It established this mindset that Caribbean land was primarily there to be exploited.
Wow. Okay, so that system defined land use for over a century. Until the mid-17th century, things shifted geopolitically. We moved from Spanish to English control.
Yes. During the Anglo-Spanish War, in 1655, English forces, led by Admiral Penn and General Venables, they captured Jamaica. Now, it wasn't a totally smooth transition. There was Spanish resistance.
But eventually,
By 1670, the shift was formalized by the Treaty of Madrid that officially transferred Jamaica from Spanish to English hands, and it kind of closed this first really brutal chapter of European control.
okay, so the English are fully in charge after 1670. The focus immediately shifts, right? Solidifying control, maximizing sugar production. But securing the island wasn't straightforward.
No, it was challenging. They even had to sort of ally with pirates, like the infamous Henry Morgan.
Right, turning Port Royal into this notorious hub.
Exactly. A major, though temporary, naval and, frankly, criminal hub. Primarily, it was a strategy to repel Spanish attempts to reclaim the island.
That alliance created this massive, incredibly wealthy urban center, which then met a pretty spectacular end.
Ugh, catastrophic. 1692. A massive earthquake and then a tsunami just devastated Port Royal. Wiped much of it out. And this environmental disaster, it forced a fundamental rethink of urban strategy on the island.
So after that devastation, where did the focus shift in terms of property development?
It shifted towards Kingston. The capital function gradually moved there.
Yeah.
By 1703, Kingston's prominence as a commercial hub was becoming undeniable.
Well, why Kingston specifically?
Primarily because of its strategic location and its fantastic deepwater natural harbor. It's just superior for trade compared to the ruined Port Royal. So the actual geography, the suitability of Kingston's land, really set the stage for modern urban growth and the concentration of commercial real estate there.
Meanwhile, across the island, the 1700s saw the plantation economy just accelerate, fueled entirely by enslaved Africans.
The sugar boom generated immense wealth, but that wealth flowed almost exclusively to the colonial elite, the plantocracy.
And that massive disparity that naturally led to fierce organized resistance.
Absolutely. And this is where we see the concept of autonomous land use really solidifying in direct opposition to the colonial system. By 1673, tensions were already high, leading eventually to the First Maroon War.
Which lasted quite a while.
It did. Roughly 1728 to 1739 or 40, and then later the Second Maroon War, 1795-96. The Maroons, these were communities of escaped slaves. They had formed independent settlements up in the mountainous, really inaccessible interior of the island.
And the sources really emphasize how effective this resistance was, specifically highlighting Queen Nanny.
Yes, we absolutely must pause on Queen Nanny, or Nanny of the Maroons. Born in Ghana, likely around 1686, She was a true 18th century freedom fighter. She led the Windward Maroons.
And her significance.
Her very existence, leading this autonomous, powerful settlement in the interior, it symbolized a direct, successful rejection of the colonial idea that all land automatically belonged to the British Crown. Her fight was fundamentally a fight for self-determination, for an alternative form of property governance, land controlled by them.
That resistance was so effective, it actually forced the British to concede some level of sovereignty, didn't it?
It did. The Treaty of Cudjostown in 1686, though technically before the main wars we just mentioned, it was part of this ongoing struggle, established a fragile peace. Crucially, it recognized Maroon autonomy and freedom within designated territories. This was an early critical victory where land, actual territory, was acknowledged as belonging outside the colonial extractive system.
But the sources bring up another layer here, something about suppressed potential that relates directly to capital formation today, the Jamaican ironworks scandal.
Ah, yes. This is genuinely shocking and frankly often ignored. It's about technological innovation happening right there in Jamaica in the 1780s.
Okay, let's unpack this historical suppression. We're talking about a functioning, thriving 18th century foundry near Morant Bay.
Exactly. And operated entirely by enslaved metallurgists, 76 of them, the records show. And they weren't just, following instructions. They pioneered a groundbreaking advanced technique.
What technique was that?
They figured out how to mass-produce high-quality wrought iron from scrap iron using specialized grooved rollers. This was cutting-edge stuff. Think Industrial Revolution-level innovation.
Happening in a colony driven by enslaved labor.
Precisely. And it was profitable. By 1781, the foundry was generating a remarkable 4,000 pounds annually. That was a huge sum back then. It proves that local industrial capital and genuine technological ingenuity existed right there.
And then the source material highlights the devastating aftermath. A British ironmaster, Henry Court.
Yes. He somehow acquired machinery, or at least detailed knowledge, from the Jamaican foundry. He took that innovative method, the grooved rollers, and he patented the entire iron production technique back in England, claiming it as his own invention.
That's just blatant technological appropriation.
It is, plain and simple. But what followed was arguably even more damaging to Jamaica's long-term economic future. The British government, apparently fearing this industrial capacity could be used by rebels or Maroons,
They ordered its destruction.
they ordered the complete destruction of the Jamaican ironworks, wiped it out.
So what does that act, destroying the ironworks, stealing its technology, what does that mean for modern property development in Jamaica? How does that connect?
Well, it speaks directly to the deliberate suppression of locally generated industrial capital. Think about it. To build sophisticated real estate factories, modern ports, advanced infrastructure, you need capital. You need money, investment, know-how.
Right.
By systematically destroying a thriving, profitable industrial base, the colonial power essentially ensured Jamaica remained primarily agricultural, a supplier of sugar and raw goods. It actively prevented the emergence of a local, potentially powerful, land-owning capitalist class.
The kind of class that might have had the foundation, the money, to invest in large-scale modern real estate development after independence.
Exactly that legacy of a deliberately created capital deficit. It impacts construction capacity, investment potential, right up to the present day. It affects who holds the foundational wealth, the land, the money needed for major development.
That is a staggering point. The deliberate destruction of internal economic capacity. Okay, so this era of intense exploitation, it eventually gives way to abolition, right? Foreshadowed by the massive Baptist War, the Sam Sharp Rebellion, in 1831-32.
A huge uprising, yes, and slavery was finally abolished throughout the British Empire in 1838.
But freedom didn't automatically mean access to land or economic equity?
Not at all. The harsh conditions imposed on the newly freed slaves led directly to the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. Now, this uprising was brutally suppressed by the authorities.
But it had consequences.
It did. It forced the British government to act. It led to significant land reforms, specifically including the distribution of some land to freed slaves. This was a pivotal moment. It began the incremental, incredibly difficult process of dismantling the plantocracy's near-total monopoly on property ownership and started giving newly free citizens their own stake, however small, in the actual soil of Jamaica.
Okay, moving into the late 19th century, we see Jamaica trying to diversify its economy, trying to redefine its physical geography a bit. By 1870, sugarcane's dominance was starting to wane.
It was, yeah. And the emergence of banana plantations began to reshape the agricultural landscape quite significantly, a new major export crop.
And the urban shift continued too. Kingston becomes the official capital.
Yes, in 1872, formally designated the capital, replacing Spanish Town. This just confirmed Kingston's economic and administrative importance, and it further accelerated the demand for both commercial and residential property within that urban core.
And then, crucially, infrastructure development starts physically connecting the island. The Jamaica Railway Company, 1891.
Right. They completed a substantial network, linking major towns and ports across the island. And this had a direct, measurable impact on land value.
How so? Explain that connection.
Well, think about the basic economics.
Yeah.
The railway drastically cut the cost and the time needed to move goods, especially perishable crops like bananas, from the interior to the ports for export.
Right, makes sense.
So this stimulated development in areas that were previously quite isolated, but were now along the rail lines. It instantly increased the potential value and the utility of the surrounding property. It made it viable for new development, for urban expansion outside of just the capital.
So, by the turn of the century, this economic growth, fueled by these agricultural exports, it's leading to increased demand for housing, commercial properties, attracting investment.
Yes, definitely attracting investment. But politically, the early 20th century was also defined by a growing political consciousness and quite a bit of unrest.
Talk about that unrest.
Well, in 1907, for instance, we see significant social and political unrest bubbling up. The labor movement was gaining ground. There were demands for political reform. And these kinds of tensions, they naturally create uncertainty in the real estate sector.
Because political instability often leads to capital flight, or at least hesitation to invest.
Exactly. Investors get nervous. But this nascent desire for self-determination, for more rights, it was being championed by figures like Marcus Garvey.
Right, Garvey. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in 1917.
That's right. And then followed up with the Negro Factories Corporation, the NFC, in 1920.
And Garvey's vision was explicitly economic, wasn't it?
Well, very much so. The NFC was designed specifically to promote industrial development, economic self-sufficiency among the African diaspora. And this ties back powerfully to that ironworks scandal we discussed.
How so?
Garvey's movement emphasized local entrepreneurship and, fundamentally, land ownership. He saw land as the bedrock of community empowerment. He was essentially trying to build the very capital base, the industrial capacity that had been systematically destroyed decades earlier.
Then the Great Depression hits in 1927.
Yeah, and that just compounded existing problems, especially housing shortages and affordability issues. It all culminated in widespread unrest in 1938, largely over unemployment and racial inequality.
And that 1938 unrest was the catalyst for forming the People's National Party, the PNP.
That's right. A major political force was born out of that turmoil.
But despite all the economic pain and unrest, political progress did continue. Universal adult suffrage in 1944.
A huge step. Introduced in 1944, it meant political power was finally distributed regardless of the old restrictions tied to wealth or property ownership restrictions that had historically disenfranchised the vast majority of the population.
And the government presumably was forced to address the critical housing shortage caused by the Depression and then World War II?
Yes, the war effort shifted the economy, logistics, supplies, creating shortages. So in the 1940s, the government introduced housing policies, including the construction of vital low-income housing estates, places like Trenchtown, Tivoli Gardens. These were direct responses to the crisis.
And this structural support for homeownership, it solidified further.
It did. In 1955, with the establishment of the Housing Trust, its mandate was very clear. Address housing needs and promote homeownership among ordinary citizens. It was a direct effort to counter that legacy of landlessness stemming from slavery and the plantation economy.
Okay, now we hit a really critical milestone for the current market structure. 1958, the Real Estate Board, REB, is established. Why was this so pivotal?
This marks the definitive move away from the sort of ad hoc, colonial-era land management towards a modern, properly governed market. The REB was created and tasked with licensing real estate agents, brokers, dealers. Its job was to establish professionalism, transparency, ethical standards.
So if you're an investor today, foreign or local, or just a citizen buying a home,
You rely entirely on the governance framework provided by the REB. It ensures titles are clear, transactions are transparent, professionals are held accountable. It basically brought the sector up to global compliance standards, which is essential for confidence in the market.
and culturally during the same period, the foundations for Jamaica's global dominance were being laid.
Musically, right?
Absolutely. The 1930s saw that fusion happening local sounds like mento and calypso mixing with imported jazz and R&B. That creative mix laid the groundwork for what would become ska, then rocksteady, and later, of course, the global phenomenon of reggae music. So that whole journey towards sovereignty, it culminates in 1962. Jamaica formally gains independence.
A massive moment.
A time for solidifying national identity, too. Jamaica House is established, the national motto, out of many, one people, is adopted. And that famous tourism slogan, Jamaica Land of Wood and Water.
All came about then, yes.
Mm.
And post-independence economic development was largely driven by really two main forces, the international growth of tourism and the global export of Jamaican culture, especially music.
Let's talk tourism first. The 1960s saw huge investment.
No, skyrocketing investment in tourism. That led to significant construction hotels, resorts, particularly in key coastal areas like Montego Bay, Ocho Rios, and Negril. This fueled massive real estate demand along those highly desirable coastlines.
Which by extension must have inflated coastal property values significantly.
Hugely. And culturally at the same time, the rise of rocksteady gave way to reggae music around 1968. The 1970s became the golden age, didn't they? Bob Marley becomes this global icon.
And reggae was more than just entertainment.
Much more. It was a powerful voice of resistance, of hope, social commentary. It connected Jamaica to the world globally and made the island itself a globally recognized brand. And that brand recognition, that cultural cachet, directly drives tourism and therefore property investment. People want a piece of that Jamaica.
This global soft power, it was formally recognized too.
Yes, first with the Grammy Awards introducing the Best Reggae Album category in 1985. And then later, and perhaps even more significantly, in 2018, UNESCO recognized reggae as intangible cultural heritage. That just cemented the culture's status as a major global force, and by extension, an economic driver.
Politically, though, the post-independence decades saw some pretty significant swings in ideology, which directly impacted land policy.
He certainly did. You had the Michael Manley PNP administration from 72. They initiated land reform programs aimed at redistributing ownership, promoting access to housing for more marginalized communities, trying to level the playing field a bit.
But that was countered by a shift in the 1980s under Edward Sega.
Yes. Sega's government ushered in an era of privatization deregulation, particularly in the real estate market.
Okay, this seems like a critical point for the modern learner, for understanding today's market. What were the implications of that deregulation?
Well, the source material suggests, and it's a common analysis, that while deregulation certainly attracted increased foreign investment, which was the aim,
Right.
it also arguably exacerbated the tension between that wealthy, globalized property market and the ongoing struggle for local affordability and equity. It kind of cemented the dual market structure we still see today.
Explain that dual structure.
You have a very high-end, often foreign investor-driven luxury sector, particularly on the coasts, running alongside persistent housing shortages and affordability challenges for the majority of the local population.
And governments continued trying to combat those shortages.
Yes, efforts continued. The National Housing Development Corporation, NHDC, was launched in 1983, and then later the National Housing Trust, NHT, in 2005.
Can you explain the practical function of the NHT? Because it seems pretty central to local home ownership possibilities.
The NHT is absolutely crucial. It functions essentially as a compulsory national savings scheme. Employed Jamaicans contribute a percentage of their earnings, and those pooled funds are then used to finance the development of affordable housing projects.
And it helps individuals buy.
Yes. Critically, it provides mortgage assistance to those contributors at subsidized interest rates significantly lower than commercial banks would offer. So, in essence, the NHT is the primary mechanism for many local citizens to overcome the massive barrier to entry created by high property values, values often driven by that global market demand.
So if the NHT is the engine, maybe, for local access, the late 80s and 90s saw the engine for foreign investment really roaring.
That's a good way to put it. Following a resurgence in tourism after some leaner years, there was a proliferation of luxury resorts, condos, and notably gated communities, especially along the coastlines.
Why the specific rise of gated communities in the 90s?
Well, it's often seen as a spatial reflection of growing income inequality and also rising concerns about security. These secure, upscale properties catered primarily to affluent tourists, members of the diaspora investing back home, and other international investors.
And what about urban development during this time?
Well, you had the Urban Development Corporation, the UDC, launched around 1993. Their focus was more on urban renewal projects, mixed-use developments, trying to revitalize blighted areas, attempting to balance that influx of high-end development with broader urban needs.
The modern era hasn't been without its challenges, though. Natural disasters.
Huge ones, like Hurricane Gilbert back in 1988, which really highlighted the need for resilience, better building codes, risk mitigation and construction. That's a constant factor in the Caribbean.
And social issues, like the 2010 operation targeting Christopher Dudas Cope in Tivoli Gardens.
Yes, events like that highlighted pockets of serious urban instability and the complex relationship between communities, security forces, and governance.
And socially, global movements have resonated locally, too.
Very much so. The 2020 protests in Kingston and Montego Bay, held in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter movement, they really brought discussions about colonial legacies, about racial injustice, and those persistent issues of land access and systemic inequality right to the forefront of the national conversation in Jamaica. It amplified those ongoing debates.
And this enduring conversation about sovereignty, about legacy, it brings us right up to the present push for Jamaica to become a republic.
Exactly. Since around 2012, under Portia Simpson Miller's government, there were increasing calls for that transition.
And those plans gained real traction recently.
Yes, particularly after Queen Elizabeth II's passing in 2022. The current government has stated a goal of achieving republic status, ideally by the time of the next general election, expected around 2025. This transition is being framed as, the ultimate historic milestone, a final act of political sovereignty designed to complete that long journey toward shaping the nation's destiny, finally unconstrained by those historical colonial ties.
Okay, so we've traced this incredible history, from communal Taino land use, through colonialism, resistance, independence, right up to this modern push for a republic. Now, let's bring it full circle. Let's look at the practical language, the tools of the contemporary property market, as detailed in that source material from Jamaica Homes. The sheer list of tools and vocabulary, it just confirms this is a highly formalized, globally integrated sector now.
It absolutely is. I mean, the very existence of these specific financial tools tells a story in itself. They offer, for instance, a mortgage calculator, a down payment calculator, an affordability calculator.
Standard enough, maybe, but what about the rent versus buy calculator or the rental yield calculator? What does the necessity of a rental yield calculator specifically tell you?
That immediately tells us the market isn't just for people looking for a home to live in. It's heavily geared towards investors. Rental yield is a calculation used almost exclusively by professional real estate investors to figure out the rate of return on a property they plan to rent out.
So it's prominent signals.
It confirms that modern Jamaican real estate is viewed internationally as an asset class, like stocks or bonds. It requires tools for sophisticated financial risk assessment, for measuring investment performance. It's global finance meeting Jamaican land.
And the vocabulary listed, the transaction statuses, they also confirm that level of transparency and standardization we talked about, established by the REB.
Definitely. You see standardized statuses like for rent, for sale, let agreed, pending sale agreed, under offer, and sold, STC, subject to contract.
These aren't unique Jamaican terms, are they?
No, not at all. They are universal markers used in many developed real estate markets to ensure clear, transparent transactions. This governance structure, put in place back in '58 and built upon since, is absolutely vital for attracting foreign capital. It reduces risk, ensures contracts are standardized. It's a world away from the chaotic, often unclear land grants of the colonial past.
Furthermore, the sheer diversity of property types listed highlights that market segmentation we touched on earlier.
It really does. You see commercial properties broken down, hotels, retail space, warehouses, and then a wide residential category. Apartments, bungalows, condos, townhouses, villas, even lofts in specific vacation homes.
And this segmentation reflects that dual market.
Precisely. The villas, the high-end condos, the vacation homes, they often cater directly to that global investment class, to wealthy tourists, to the diaspora looking for a luxury base. Whereas the apartments and townhouses, often facilitated by organizations like the NHT we discussed, cater more towards the local population and address those affordability constraints. The structure allows for both, but the prices, especially near the coast, inevitably reflect global demand meeting relatively limited prime supply.
Now, beyond the financial structure and the market mechanics, the architecture itself tells a story, doesn't it? A story of cultural reconciliation, perhaps. While a lot of new luxury construction might look, well, international, modern,
Right.
the sources point to the integration of cultural heritage, too, notably a distinct influence from African architecture.
Yes. Specifically influences often seen in West African building traditions, like some Senegalese styles, for example. These began to influence inland home design particularly. And this is more than just aesthetics. It's a kind of cultural statement.
How so? What features are we talking about?
These designs often emphasize things like open courtyards, natural ventilation methods, features that blend practicality with beauty.
Why is that blending significant, culturally speaking?
Well, you could argue it connects the diaspora and Jamaica itself back to African roots through the physical space of the home. The designs emphasizing passive cooling, communal courtyard spaces are actually perfectly suited to the Caribbean climate, much more so often than imposing European styles that weren't designed for the tropics.
So it represents a conscious choice.
Perhaps, yeah. A choice to adopt designs linked to resilience, to self-determination, rather than strictly adhering to colonial structures that were often, frankly, ill-suited and represented imposition. This architectural choice can be seen as another subtle expression of cultural sovereignty.
And supporting all this growth, the market growth, the architectural expression, the investment, is the Jamaican diaspora. The sources since 2016 really highlight their pivotal role.
Absolutely pivotal. Through remittances, direct investments, transfer of knowledge and skills. That diaspora investment is a crucial, stabilizing force for the economy.
How does it connect specifically to real estate?
When Jamaicans living abroad invest in property back home, whether it's building a family home for retirement, buying a rental property, or even investing in a commercial venture, it channels reliable capital directly into the national economy. It connects them tangibly back to their homeland, and it fuels local real estate growth, construction jobs, everything down the line. It's a literal investment in their own legacy and the country's. Hashtag tag tag out, try counting.
Wow. So this deep dive has really shown us the incredibly complex tapestry of Jamaican history, hasn't it? We went from the sustainable land practices of the Taino through the violent imposition of the encomienda system. We traced the epic struggle of the Maroons for autonomy, analyzed that disastrous suppression of local industrial capital at the Morant Bay Iron Works, and then mapped the long path to independence and the vital formalization of the modern property market by bodies like the REB and the NHT.
The entire journey, it's almost perfectly encapsulated by that Jamaican national proverb, every mickle muckle muckle, every little bit adds up.
Right.
Jamaica's sovereignty, the resilience of its modern market, none of it was just granted. It was accumulated painstakingly over centuries through countless small, persistent acts of cultural preservation, armed resistance, political negotiation, economic effort.
It makes it so clear that the modern value of Jamaican land, it doesn't just stem from the beautiful beaches or its agricultural potential. It comes from the immense human struggle, the resilience, even the technological genius that was historically suppressed and then had to be fought for, rebuilt.
And that, I think, leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. As Jamaica stands on the cusp of this historic transition, becoming a republic, finally completing its journey of political sovereignty, how will this new governance structure navigate that stark tension? The tension between the highly globalized, often exclusionary, luxury property market on one side.
And the deep, complicated, often painful legacy of land, labor, and dispossession on the other.
Exactly.
Sure.
Will this push for full sovereignty, for becoming a republic, fundamentally redefine the meaning of property ownership itself? Will it lead to new mechanisms for access, for equity, ensuring that the profound legacy of the land is finally reconciled with the immense global market value it now commands? It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? Legacy versus luxury, and it's a question the new republic will inevitably have to confront.